Good morning. Ahoy. I am David Ortega, as Vraska said. I am an architect from Mexico City. I studied in Universidad La Salle. It's a private university in Mexico City. Then I worked as an architect for 5 years, doing basically buildings. And then I decided to change a bit direction and went to Sweden, to Stockholm, for studying urban planning and design for 2 years there. That was in 2009 till 2011. And then I decided to go back to Mexico City because it was too cold for me, Stockholm. And then I started this wonderful journey of urban design and urban planning in Mexico City. And I will tell you more about what's the day-a-day practice that I do, because it's really a mixture of different levels of things. Basically, it's all about design, designing spaces, designing places. And it goes from like the bigger scale of a city to actually the smaller scale of furniture. I actually do also interior design on my free time, which is non-existent, but I do it. And I mean, the complete job that I have, the day-by-day job, is actually doing office, working for the Office of Urban Planning of Mexico City. And I also teach at the university. I teach in architecture school, the second year of architecture school, and it's public, how do you say that? Housing, collective housing. And I call it collective housing in the city, so that I can really put everything together, all the themes that I work with every day. So we'll see here a lot of these things. Well, not a lot. I mean, it's a short period. 1 day, it sounds a lot, but I think for the whole things that we've been working with in 2 years, it's quite a short time. But of course, if you feel like knowing more or digging more into the activities, feel free to ask, and I can give you even more information about it. So to sum up, I work for Urban Development and Housing Ministry in Mexico City. I teach at the university, at architecture school, and I do private practice from urban planning to architecture practice. This is the biggest thing. Well, first, I would like to introduce Mexico City with a short video.
Damas y caballeros, en pocos minutos estaremos aterrizando en la Ciudad de México. En nombre de esta tripulación les damos la más cordial bienvenida y esperamos que su estancia sea placentera. Son las 5 de la mañana, hora local. La temperatura actual es de 16 grados centígrados. Que tengan un excelente día.
I know it's very inspiring video, and that is the point of this introduction, because personally it is a very inspiring place where I work, and every time the city is so big and it's full of so many things that there's always things that make you feel like keep on going, or inspirational things to do. It's very, how do you say that? It pushes you to keep on doing things there. Every single thing happening, like the weirdest things or surreal things going on in the city, are always there. So you feel like keep on doing things for the place, for the people there. So basically, this is the canvas that we work with, so to say. And well, of course, not everything is pretty and cool and dancing and and partying. It's a very complex reality. It's a super complex place, full of also problems, of course. I mean, if we start talking about the quantity of people and everything, it's very challenging. Mexico City is the capital of Mexico. It is in the right kind of in the center of the country. Of course, it belongs of the group of the megalopolis in the world. It's not the biggest city in the world anymore. We're like around the third, fourth largest city in the world. Tokyo is already overpassed, but we were famous in the 80s, in the 90s for being the biggest city in the world. And well, we kind of still keep that fame, and maybe that's why it's also interesting to talk about it. You can see here comparisons of other big megalopolis in the world, and how Mexico City it is located. Of course, compared to Prague, it sounds funny, I know, but I guess and I bet we will find a lot of similarities when it comes to like social issues sometimes, or planning issues, or design issues in the cities, because at the end problems are global, like commuting, public space, housing, economy, social development, and everything. So I think we will find a lot of things in common in these general terms, but of course the scale, we have to be aware that it's multiplied by 20 all the time. So this is very interesting as well. In the North America region, we belong to North America region. We're in the Northern Hemisphere, so now it's winter as well, winter. We belong to these kind of big cities of North America. Of course, the United States, with their more than 300 million people, it's much bigger, but we represent in our own country 20% of the population. Mexico City has above 100 million people, and Mexico City is above 20 million people. That's the number from the 2010 census. So then, yeah, what is Mexico City, right? This is like the biggest question. What is all this about? Well, as you saw in the video, it's a lot of things. It's a lot of realities. It's a lot of complexity. Very different territories. Very different types of people. A lot of typologies of spaces, and very complex dynamics. And so to understand more about what it is about, the city, I'll talk about historical background. Why there? Because it's actually a valley it's surrounded by mountains with an altitude of 2,000 meters above sea level. It's quite high. So then the temperature gets much milder than in the coastal zones, where it's basically tropical. This is more like mountainous climate, with around the temperature around the year is 15 to 20 degrees Celsius. We can reach 0 degrees. Actually, the mountains around can get snowed. in the winter time, and then in summertime it's our rainy season, so it's around from like June to September we have heavy rainfall in the afternoons. And then the warmest season is spring, around May, which we reach no further than 30, 32. So it's never too hot, it's never too cold. It's quite a mild weather. So that's also one of the features that allowed the development of a civilization since ancient times. So basically, the Valley of Mexico is, it used to be a lake, a big lake. Half of the lake was sweet, fresh water, and the other half of the lake is actually very salty soil. It is not that quite fresh water that doesn't allow that much of life, so to say, because the soil is very salty. And this is all mountains around, some mountains in the middle, and volcanoes around here. There's a lot of, we are in a volcanic area as well, so it's also a very, you might know, it's an earthquake zone. So this is, so that you are aware, you see in the maps here the shape like a drop, and you see it here with the black stroke where the city is located. So basically all this is urbanized. The lake is drained, and our city is over an older lake. It was founded in 1325 by the Aztecs. The Aztecs were a tribe that came from the north of the country, and they arrived to the Valley of Mexico, and they started to fight the territories there. And with several conquests and wars, they finally settled in the middle of the lake in these man-made islands. Actually, they are man-made islands. And they set their civilization there in the 1300s. And through 200 years, which is actually for those ancient times quite short period of time, they managed to make an empire that arrived down to Central America, to Nicaragua actually. So they had a huge, huge control on the territory of this Middle America. There were a lot of towns all around here that had a lot of communication with the empire, with the main city. And they were these traditional towns that had a lot of commercial activities in the lake area. And we'll see that through the history and the formation of the city, how these little towns got swallowed, so to say, by the city, so that it is a mixture of former towns, pre-Hispanic towns, with the further civilization from the Spanish that came. And so it's this very complex mixture of layers that built up the city. This is how it looked when Hernán Cortés arrived, the conqueror from Spain. This is how the city looked like, this artificial island that you saw in the middle of the lake with all the mountains around. And this is how it looks now. This is all the city around with these same mountains that you can see here, and these two volcanoes on the east part of the city. As I was saying, this is the first big civilization in the valley. It's Tenochtitlan. That was the original name of Mexico City. And it lasted from 1325 to 1521 when the Spanish conquered. This had a very particular way of settling, because the central part of the city, where now it's the city center, it used to be the religious center and also the commercial center. And then all around we have these artificial islands. They have a specific name, and actually they have a specific system where how they were built. So the connection between agriculture and commerce and religion was very tight. And this is how the Aztecs developed their society, with the agriculture in artificial islands with this specific system. It's called Chinampa. And basically it is artificial land that they put together, and they use these specific willow trees that can hold the soil so that it doesn't get fluffy. And so then you have canals that feed with water the land, and then the soil where you can have plantations. This is a very interesting system that it's very rare actually in many places. It's very unique. And this is how actually still there are parts of the city that survive in this way. So actually if you visit, you can see how it worked and how it works still in terms of agriculture. So even when New Spain, that was our second name, we were the New Spain, from 1521 to 1810, still worked. The system remained, but of course Spanish had other types of understanding the environment, understanding the nature. And what happened is that on top of the pyramids, they destroyed the pyramids, and then on top of them they built the churches. They built their own temples. It is very interesting also because if you go on the side of the church of this, the main cathedral of Mexico City, you will find the temples there. So you can see actually the layers, the lake, the pyramids, and the churches that nowadays still remain. In the 1600s, there was a huge flood in the city center of Mexico, and Spanish didn't know how to handle it. So they decided to drain it. And since it's a high lake, it is easier somehow to drain the water. So then that was the starting point where the water started to fade away. The Aztecs were, I would say, a bit more clever. They could manage better the water. And actually, because as I mentioned with the lake, that it's half salty and half fresh, they had a dike here. So they were really clever using the fresh water for human purpose and leaving the salty as natural place without really touching it. Compared with Spanish that started to drain out the whole and making more usable land for growing and growing. And then after that, that was a big jump, but it is very much what happened. The city started to grow and grow. I have more historical maps. We can take a look later. But basically, after that, the city started to grow towards different sites and started to merge with all these traditional historical towns that were around the lake area. So half of the city, it is on a lake soil, so it is really hard to build on. You dig in 1 meter and then you already have water there. And if you add up to the earthquake, it is really complex and challenging to build up. In 1985, we had major earthquake around 8.2 Richter scale, which is quite big. And basically half of the city was destroyed. So then the building code changed, and from the end of the 80s till now, there is more control on building code, and the building has improved quite a lot. So engineering-wise, the city is quite advanced in that term. So this is the context. This is what we have in the territory of Mexico City. And I will explain also more about the political and geographical division because it's a bit complicated. But we have this super urban environment with big buildings and housing and everything. And then we have also the contrast in the south with this more natural landscape with plantations and so. So this is what is not that clear here. It's too bright, but I will explain. This is the territory of the federal district. That's what it is called officially in the Constitution. This is around 50 kilometers width and 60 kilometers length here. So this is what we work with, politically speaking. That's the Federal District Territory, which half of it is conservation land, and the other half is the urban area. And in that area, we host around 9 million people. So that's what we work with officially. But the metropolitan area has grown up so much that in the other state, it's called the State of Mexico, and this is a bit also complex because there's Mexico, the country, the city of Mexico, and the State of Mexico, which is this big portion of land. And here there are around 12 million people. It is really challenging because, politically speaking, we cannot work on this, and there is not such a metropolitan authority. There are plans for the metropolitan area, but nothing can be really done legally because the constitution, the country is a republic. So then every state is independent, and they all have their own budget, and they have their own, even their own party ruling, because they're quite independent. And even within municipalities also, they are independent, so to say. So it is very complex in that matter, and we can dig on those things if you're interested, how this super complex reality works with, I don't know, achieving metro lines, for example, or train lines, or roads, right? Because that's things that go beyond the territory. So this is the first ring of the city. It's like 30 kilometers perimeter, like 8 kilometers wide. And then this is the second ring now. This point here is where Main Square is, where you saw the pyramids and the cathedral. And then we have a system that it's been defined since like the 60s, of a radial structure that connects to the outskirts of the city, and then the two rings, and then some other important avenues in the city center. But there are many issues with this because, for example, the inner ring has been finished quite recently, like in the 80s, 90s. And then the second ring is actually in this part of the city up to around here with high-speed road. But on the other side, it's just a regular road, so it doesn't really work as a whole ring. And this has to do, of course, with a lot of things that you've seen already, with like being hilly on this side, and this side is more lake. So then the development of the city is very uneven. This side of the city is more rich, is wealthier, because they have better soil. And then this part of the city is newer somehow, and they have less facilities and less development. So then also even the forces of the government has pushed more development on one side than on the other. For example, road-wise speaking. In terms of mobility, we'll take a look on how the network works, but it's quite similar also. So as we were saying, the population of the city of, and this is also very interesting, I'm going to make a division because officially, as I said, that's what we work with, but we always have to consider the whole, right, the metropolitan area. So in terms of population, we're around 9 million people, but the metropolitan area is 21. The population growth of Mexico City is 0.27, and the metropolitan area is 0.85. We have a growing population of youngsters and elderly people. This is very fast how it changed since late 80s. Before we had a more even population, but in the baby boom of the 70s and 80s, the whole city context changed. So then now it started to balance again, and youngster population is growing and elderly population is growing. So of course, for governmental and for designing spaces, this is a challenge because we have to think about elderly, right? We have to think about youngsters' opportunities, how students will live, how elderly will live in the city. Because, I don't know, 20 years ago, families were like 5 members living, and now we have a dynamics of people living alone or youngsters sharing apartments. And the city hasn't been like fast enough to respond to these dynamics. So it's really a challenge in terms of even designing housing, for example. We have a big problem of abandoned housing, and we'll talk more about that or why it happened. But in the central areas of Mexico City, there are a lot of houses abandoned. And then contrary to the outskirts where there's a lot of housing projects pushing, but then we have a lot of problems because it's only housing. It's like dormitory cities, dormitory places that people have to commute very long distances to get to where the work is, which is the central areas of the city. So then these dynamics that have been working for over 10, 20 years already have pushed to the abandonment of the city center. And now we have to deal with this issue and start being very creative on how to relocate the people and not pushing them farther, but making them closer. And then, well, the housing growth, it's quite okay yet. There's a lot of real estate development in the city. It's quite active yet, but also because of the social inequity, there is a lot of troubles with how to do housing for the poor people and how there's a lot of offer for higher classes that there are maybe not so many. So then it's also where and how we mix this housing complexity in the areas of the city. We work a lot with this very important concept, and also we discuss about public space because it is a change in paradigm in recent years in the cities, how we build up the cities starting from the public realm instead of starting from the housing realm. And this is a very interesting point of departure because this is how we start shaping or designing or planning the city. Instead of, as it was in the 50s, in the 60s, that housing was like the cell or the unit of building the city, then we changed that idea to the public space, to the common areas, and how this is going to really shape the city. We have around 3,300 public spaces, and I call it public space, a park, a plaza, small squares, even markets also can be considered as public spaces. So we kind of grew up the realm of what to be considered as a public space because it is very much about public occupation rather than just a place to stay or to have a picnic. Even the streets, we are now considering, of course, the cell of the public space. So then when you think of a street as a public space, then the way of thinking about it's changed. It's not only about cars passing by, but also a place for social interaction, for these dynamics of the social tissue. We have 6 historical centers, which were the former towns that I talked about. 180 heritage sites. It's a lot of heritage, of course, in the city, and there's a lot of effort to keep on the heritage of the city, of course. 30 conservation areas, which are these forests or natural forests around. 8 archaeological sites. More than 3,000 monuments, and of course sports centers and playgrounds. And when I talk about this, for example, sports centers and playgrounds, they are public oriented. Of course there is a lot of and it's more and more, unfortunately, the private-owned spaces. Even the developments that we face now are like gated communities more and more. Speaking of security issues, so then more and more we're facing a lot of closed, private-owned spaces that are not really open to the society. So then we face a lot of problems with like, for example, upper class ghettos with all the amenities inside, and then you go out in the street and it's just like walls and no one walking there. So it's really a problem. So that's why we talk a lot about the public-oriented places, even, for example, with sports facilities and so on. The green area, of speaking of meters, square meters by inhabitant, is around 8.4, which is not that bad, considering the health organization, World Health Organization, that says a minimum of 10 is okay, 10 square meters per inhabitant. But of course, this sometimes is tricky because the quality of the greenery is not the best. The quality of the public spaces are not the best. So then this number is not really quite an indicator for greenery or for the health of the people. And even with the pollution, air pollution, which also you might hear a lot of how polluted we are. Well, since 1990, we've developed a lot of programs, really, really strict for controlling air pollution. And now we are proud to say we're lowering our levels of pollution and we're improving in that matter. Mexico City has signed an agreement to improve emissions within 30 years. So then there's a lot of commitment with authorities and people in general to lower these emissions in the short and in the long term. Another very interesting and important topic that we cover in terms of the city dynamics is, of course, mobility. And it's another big issue and another big theme to work with. This is actually public space and mobility, like I would say, my favorite themes, because these are the ones that really define the public, right? And we have around 21 million trips a day. It means commuting, right, from one place to the other. This is an Origin Destiny survey that was made in 2007. We're pushing really hard to have a new survey because we know that these numbers are surpassed already for long, but this is the numbers that we can work with now. We have about 4 million trips of metro. We have 12 lines of metro. And also, the metro lines are not in the whole metropolitan area. Actually, the metro lines are just in the federal district, which is a very, very hard and complex system because a lot of people going from the surroundings, they have to take like little buses to get to these points, like the border city, where the end of lines of the metro are, and then go to the city center. So we receive around 6 million people every day coming inside the city and then leaving the city again. So metro dynamics or public transportation dynamics are really heavy. There is a metro station that receives 1 million people every day. So it's like, I don't know, like Shibuya, Japan or something like that. It's really, really complex. And this is because of, as I mentioned in the beginning, political things that doesn't allow really to grow more the metro lines and budget-wise and how to get the budget for the metropolitan area, et cetera, et cetera. We have also BRT, which is bus rapid transit. I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but basically it is buses that are within a specific lane with no cars, and then with specific stops, and you pay in advance. So it has like a station with, we'll see pictures of it. You have a station where you pay in advance and then you jump in the bus. So it works kind of like a metro, but it's a bus. And this is a very clever system that was invented in Curitiba in Brazil in the 70s. And it has spread out in the whole Latin America. And we have already 5 lines of Metrobus, which are actually working quite okay in many places, because it costs 10 times less than the metro. Building the tunnel and the whole thing, it's super expensive, and the Metrobus, it's more affordable in that case. We have the biggest transportation is minibus. It's these little buses that are very irregular and that they are controlled by the government, but they are privately owned. So then there's not a lot of control with the quality, with the routes, with the set stops. There are not like stops that you can stop anywhere. You just raise your hand and then the bus stops there, and then you can ask the driver to drop you off in the middle of a highway maybe. So it's really complex and it's really bad in that way, but we're working a lot with pushing them out and gaining well-planned transportation. We have shared bike system. We have above 10,000 trips with EcoBici is the name of the system. It's just like the one in Barcelona, the one in London. And compared to the city area, it's quite a small area, the city shared bike. But very successful actually. It is very successful, and of course because of weather, and it's a flat city, so then there's a lot of convenience for using the bikes. And of course a huge issue with cars. It's not compared in terms of percentage. You might say like, well, it's okay, 27% of mobility by cars. But when you are there and you see like the roads completely full with cars, and you say like, okay, there's a problem here. And of course there's a lot of things involving the car-oriented mobility. First, in Mexico we have nationalized the oil, so then gasoline is not that expensive. Then since the 80s, there's a lot of facilities to get a car. There's a lot of credits for owning a car, so then it's quite easy to buy a car. Of course, American influence, having a car is status. So then people, when they have their first job, and then the first thing they get is a car, because then it says like, okay, I'm starting to be successful. So there's a lot of these other issues that we cannot fight as an urbanist or as a planners, but they exist, and so that we have to create options. That's the idea of working with mobility things. We have to create options of mobility so that people realize that car is not the only option, but rather taking maybe a short trip by bike and then take a trip by metro, or mixing, even walking, right? It is proved that most of the trips in the city are less than 8 kilometers, and people can take like above an hour in these 8 kilometers just because they take the car and they just stuck in traffic. And this is something also about kind of education to the people, how to like start using the car less and start walking at least, for example. So this is a bit of mobility issues. The land, we have around 32 square kilometers of urban surface, as I mentioned in the map. We can take a look at the map again. And then more than half of the land of federal district is conservation land. This is very interesting, I would say, for urban planning and for regional planning. In the 1980s, we had a lot of human settlements growing and growing, as I mentioned, with the baby boom and everything, and with the migration in the city. So then the authorities decided to draw a line in a map to say, from here to there, it is conservation land, and the rest is urban land. What happens is that, of course, that line is surpassed, is overpassed. So then all the people that live outside the line are informal settlements, because legally they are not considered as urban. So then there is a lot of conflict with these spaces. It doesn't really matter. They can be irregular settlements like shanty towns, And it also can be actually very well built buildings with like skyscrapers and things like that. But they even invade it's less, of course, less common with the big real estate developments. It's more common with like favela, shanty towns. But the draw of the line has been a big effort, and it's the only one in the whole country that, the only entity in the whole country that has this line drawn. And it somehow has helped, even though it's surpassed already, it has kind of buffered the conservation land. So it is quite still a very large protected land area still. We have around 2.83% of brownfields. That also has to do with the dynamics everywhere in the world. The city used to be quite industrial in the 20th century, but then by the end of the 70s, it started to decline. And then in the 90s, when we signed this international agreement with the US and Canada, the fair trade with the North America region, then the industry started to move northern because so they could be closer to the main roads. So then the city started to push out the industry. So we have a lot of brownfields that are reoccupied, and we're going to talk about one specific site that has been a very challenging zone now of this converted area of the city. And then we have 28 square kilometers of informal settlements. It is around 800 informal settlements in the city. Very complex. It's very political. It's about many times about gaining votes for the municipalities, so that the municipality says, if you give me votes, I'll give you land, and then people occupy the land, and then they promise to be legalized after the period ends. And then it doesn't happen, maybe it does, but that doesn't mean that they're going to get the services, right? They might just get the paper, and it's nothing. And it's a very, very, very complex and conflictive dynamics with the occupation of land. We can also talk about that later and find out maybe in this group ideas on how to address these kind of issues, because it's really, really interesting. So, to sum up these challenges, what are the challenges that we face every day? Urbanization, of course. The growth of the city, it's bigger and bigger, and it keeps on going, and how to stop it, or do we want to stop it, or how are we going to keep on going, right? How are we going to take all these services, all these amenities that people need, the opportunities for work, the opportunities for housing, the opportunities of public spaces, of all these things that people need for social development. How are we going to protect our areas and our historical towns, our heritage, right? It is known by people that work with the territory, like me, like us, that if we don't have this half of the territory as a protected land, we would be completely collapsed already. If it's not because of this portion of land, we would be completely out there because it's our source of water, it's our source of oxygen, it's our source of greenery, it's our source of a lot of things. So we will always think about this artificial landscape of the city, but it's nothing without the natural landscape. And very few people actually are aware of this very fragile balance in between the nature and the urban. Yeah, the protected areas and the historical towns, the occupation on land, the invasion of land, and so on. Emissions, of course, is another challenge. Mobility, as I mentioned. How are we going to get the people off the car? How are we going to give options for mobility? How are we going to make proximity in the city? That means, in terms of mobility, they say that the best trip in a city is the one that is never done. So then we need to make it closer and closer, the distances in the city, so that people can have everything within walking distance, or few metro or metro bus stops and that's also a challenge of land use, right? Because that's how you can intensify or densify the city. Housing, of course, is not, I mentioned that the public realm is like the biggest issue, but of course housing it's quite an issue. And how do we respond to the dynamics of this occupation of around 3.2 inhabitants per household? This is the average of occupation in the city. And again, how do we respond to the dynamics of youngsters, the elderly, the kids, the children, etc. in these conditions? So how, right? It's very complex, and that's why also we started when I work with the office with my boss and in our small team, we always wonder, like, is it worth it? Is it worth it to do planning in such a complex reality? How are we going to do it? So how do we plan versus what is there already? I mean, it's not like a starting from scratch city. It's like a colleague said, like, it's like changing the tire of a car while it's going. So it's really challenging. But I think, and we have concluding that term, we need it still. We need to be creative enough to like plan things and try to not to always solve problems, but rather anticipate to issues and then try to improve the planning discipline. And also a big issue is how do we manage with the general reality of the whole complexity of the whole territory versus the particular reality of a household, of a family, of an inhabitant. That's quite an issue, of course, I think everywhere. You might know the word NIMBY, for example. That, yeah, I love metro stations, but don't put it in front of my house. Yeah, I love biking, that's great, but don't put it there. No, I need my place for parking my car. So it always happens, these contradictions on facing like the collective benefits against like the personal benefits. And more we're understanding that it is very important that we address more the collective issues, the collective problems. And then they have to be above the personal interests, because so far the city has been built on personal interests most of the times. And that's why there's a lot of contradictions in the territory. There's a lot of contradictions in many of the things that we are living with. So then the construction of the city responds to the dynamics of course, population, territory, and economy. Those are like the spheres that we work with. So how to respond, as I said, to these continuous contradictions, right? How to start planning from general to particular. Is it really necessary to set a vision to the city? What do we want? What do we imagine the city to be like? And how to establish the criteria of that vision accurate enough, but flexible enough so that it can be implemented. We cannot be rigid. We cannot be totalitarian. We cannot be like, this is going to be this way and I don't care about the rest. It can't happen this way. We are a democracy, so we have to build up reality in a balance of like top-down policies, but also always bottom-up initiatives and taking care of what the people are about, what they are interested in, what they want for the reality, what they want for the everyday life. And of course, this is huge challenge. And I think it's huge for any city, even though it's a small town of 10,000 people. Agree on something with 10,000 people, it's hard. I mean, agreeing with 5 people is hard. So it's really something. So we need transverse strategies. We always think about these policies, ideas, things that have to be always running in transverse lines, because they have to address different levels, they have to address different interests, they have to go through different territories, etc. So this is also a continuous concept that we work with. And as I mentioned, participatory planning is also a key. Empowering the people, educating the people in terms of urban. Cities are actually in fashion, I would say. Everyone talks about mobility now. Everyone talks about public space or things like that. It's very, very in fashion. So how to give the tools to the people so that they understand what it is about, so that they contribute properly to the benefit of the city. Because many times, if you just give like a plain paper to someone to write down their ideas, they might be helpful, but they might be also very personal. And so then you understand that maybe they have to consider always the collective, as I was saying. So it is about giving tools for the people in participatory planning, and then get the feedback from them to grow and to do these collective contributions. So then, yes, in the government, this is my governmental side, we set a vision. We have a vision already. We signed an agreement on the 23rd of January this year to set the concepts, what we want the city to be like for the future. We also set general strategies, and we also set spatial planning as this tool for approaching and getting there. So what are the 4 concepts that we work with? We want a compact city, we want a dynamic city, we want an equitable city, and we want a polycentric city. So compact is not only about density. People are really scared in Mexico because of the influence of the United States with this suburban life. People think that the best way of living is having a house with a porch, with a backyard, with a front yard, and with a car. And that's how we build it more and more. But then we have realized this is not worth it. I mean, it destroys nature, it destroys the cities, it kills the cities. So people are really afraid of density. They are like, no, density means like concentration of people, lack of hygiene, lack of services. But then we say, okay, so then it's cheaper to take the water like 30 kilometers away, or like growing the pipes here in the city center. What is better, right? So we start to work with these concepts of density, and more people are understanding that if you want to live in the city, you have to be dense enough. And I don't mean dense like maybe Manhattan or Chinese cities, but you need this balance of density, that you have proper services within a compact territory. Proximity, as I mentioned, with the trips, the best trip is the one that is never done. This is about the use, the land use, the mixed use. So then we're working a lot on how to mix the uses of the buildings so that you can have all the opportunities of what you need in this capacity. More and more in the city center, there's more mixed developments, but let's face it, in the city, it's very much about this is a housing area, this is an office area, this is a central area, and then that's why the big commuter issues happen. And of course, neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are like the cell of the city, the identity of the neighborhoods, keeping this life, the neighborhood life, knowing your neighbors, going to the market, going to the stationery shop, going to the alimentary shop. This is how we envision the places to be like. This is something, it's not about what we want, but about what it is like. It's already a polycentric city. Even though the city center is very, very active and very powerful, still we have a lot of other cities, other centers within the city that works as business districts or commerce districts, etc. So then, how do these centers work for improving the life, the development, the economical development? How do they reactivate this land? Sometimes There are centers in the city that are not really well developed, so they need more input of uses, economical injections, etc., to create better opportunities. And of course, the investment that has to be from public investment to private investment. We have to be also clever enough to merge them all, because then that creates this responsibility on the development of the city. We want, and we are already a very dynamic city, but we want it more dynamic, because dynamic for us means also security. The public life, it's huge in the city, but we need more. We want the people to go out on the street. We want to use the spaces. We want to use the parks. We want to use the plazas. And so far, there's a lot of decline in the use of public space because of the emerging of, for example, shopping malls or things like that, they become kind of like the public space, the places where people meet. But there's been, in the last 10 years, programs of the use of public space, like festival of whatever in the city center, and it's been like amazingly huge success. It's really something else. And that's the only indicator that says that we need to do more. We need to occupy the public space. We need to go out on the streets. It's really important. And of course, weather allows, and many things allow it. That creates also identity, and that creates the common space. Equitable. This is very, very important also for the city. Elderly, as I mentioned, youngsters, handicapped, indigenous people, migrants, all this complexity of social life happens in the city, and many times we are not clever enough to be inclusive enough, to be equitable enough. And we need to design the city towards that equity. So this is also a challenge. So then we can be competitive, we can be evitable, and we can have a right to the city, which is also a big important concept that we work with. So where does all this happen? I think I said too much about these concepts, and so maybe you want to know where this happens. So this is a kind of a dynamic map in which we're gonna try to understand more of these dynamics. This is the population concentration within the federal district. This is like nodes of population, big housing areas. And this is the opportunities for working areas. So if you see, compared to this, you have a lot of people living here, a lot of people living here, and a lot of people living outside, of course. But then you have the working areas, which is this kind of T shape with other spots. Actually, most of the people come here to work. This is where like the main hubs of development happen. And so then all the trips come there. It's very, in the morning, everything goes there. And in the night, they all leave. So then there's a lot of pressure of this expansion. On one side, there is a pressure to invade the conservation land. And on the other side, there's a pressure of inhabiting the suburbia, because also land is cheaper, for example. It has to do a lot with economy. People they can't afford to live in the city center, so they have to move farther and farther. So then there's this inequity that we have in the territory, right? A lot of opportunities in one side for work, and a lot of opportunities of housing on the other side, and not equitable. The conservation land, as I mentioned, all these areas, here is the line that I talked about, and all these pink areas are the illegal settlements. So then how do we work with this protection land? all the parks and the heritage. You saw these crops with the canals are all these areas. This is all the areas where the crops are with the canals. And all these are national parks that we saw, some of them. And then we have the city center here, and all these areas are heritage zones here and here. This is the university that also has a protection area, and historical towns all over. So this is also territory that we have to be aware of. Strategic development zones where, like, as I mentioned, these post-industrial sites and things like that are around. From airport that is inside the city, post-industrial sites, university, the conservation crops area that also it's a potential for development, maybe not urban heavy speaking, but you need to activate it, and business district, for example. And of course, these corridors that put it all together, how are we going to connect them all, right? How are we going to put them in a network? We see it, the city more as a network than a pieces of land, but it needs to be connected. These nodes of transportation, like hubs, where also a lot of mobility happen, and metropolitan poles, as I mentioned, where people living, for example, here, they have to take a bus, and then they get off here, and then they take the train or the metro already inside the city. So this becomes a very important nodes in the city. So this is kind of this spatial strategy that we work with in very general terms. Intensifying, of course, and putting more pressure and effort in the city center, and then in the middle city, we say, and then in the outskirts. So this is kind of the network that we work with. You can see it in the maps, and we can work with this more later on. So this is kind of like the basic strategy of the elements that we work with. And in parallel, in the governmental side, we work with projects that they have to prove us right or wrong. They have to be like these pilot projects that they say, okay, yeah, what we envision as the city complexity with all these concepts of the vision and this spatial strategy, where to put the effort, where not to put the effort, like kind of opening the water tap a bit more here and close it a bit more there, so that you start to balance these forces. These are the projects that we work with. So we have a lot of projects of public space, of course, refurbishing parks, refurbishing squares, refurbishing public spaces, and it is interesting because most of them have been paid by private initiative. Government is not that well with getting resources with taxation, so then you have to involve private initiative to do big projects in the city. So there are quite a few and growing more instruments to engage private initiative to reconvert public spaces more and more, but it's really challenging. Transportation hubs. We have a project for the first big transportation hub in the city that moves around 500,000 people every day. So it's now ongoing, and I think the works will start next year. The development zones, as I mentioned, these areas that were industrial formerly, and now they changed, and now they look like this. And they have a lot of problems also with mobility, car-oriented places, housing issues, etc., etc. We'll talk about that. And markets. The city has a lot of markets. We have 328 public markets, which means it's public land. Land that is owned by the government, and they become this kind of the center of the neighborhood. It's like the neighborhood hub, And it is a huge potential there to develop the markets in the city. And actually now there is a competition, an international competition for this huge market. This one is called Merced. People from everywhere has been participating in improving this area. It's the size of Les Halles in Paris. It's a huge, huge, huge market. And we can talk about that later on.